Kash Patel calls Ibrahim Traoré stupid. Then he sends a response that changes everything. We dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of the month. Subscribe, leave a like, and be part of this dream too. The interview was supposed to be routine. Kash Patel, former Trump advisor, appeared on a conservative media program to discuss emerging threats to Western interests. But when the host brought up Africa's shifting alliances, Patel scoffed. "You mean Ibrahim Traoré," he said with a chuckle. "The guy's stupid. He thinks he can kick out the French, talk tough to the West, and somehow not pay the price? That's not strategy, it's stupidity." The words echoed. The host smiled awkwardly, but the damage was done. The clip hit social media within hours, subtitled in French, then in dozens of African languages. And the outrage began. Traoré, thousands of miles away in Ouagadougou, didn't respond immediately. His team advised against dignifying the comment. But the president remained quiet for another reason. He was listening, watching, observing how the African people, from youth groups in Bamako to elders in Kinshasa, reacted. The insult hadn't offended him personally. It had ignited something deeper. "He didn't call me stupid," Traoré told his press secretary in private. "He called all of us incapable. He insulted the future we're building." 4 days, he said nothing publicly. But inside the presidential palace, he began preparing his answer. Meanwhile, global media tried to spin the clip. Some dismissed it as a slip of the tongue. Others framed it as tough talk from a former intelligence figure. But on the streets of Africa, it was fuel. Artists painted murals of Traoré standing above the word stupid, crossed out in red. Hashtags like #WeAreNotStupid and #TraorSpeaksForYous began trending across the continent. In schools, students turned the insult into essay prompts. In churches and mosques, preachers wove it into sermons. The remark had done more than offend, it had unified. Kash Patel, perhaps unknowingly, had handed Africa a common fire. Then, late one night, a press release from the presidency of Burkina Faso appeared. Just a single line, "He will respond, in front of the world." No time, no location, no further comment. But it was enough. Analysts speculated everything from a speech at the UN to a viral video. Supporters waited eagerly. Critics grew nervous. What could he possibly say that would matter? What answer could reverse the sting of that insult? But those who knew Traoré understood. He never responded with noise. He responded with truth. And when truth speaks, even the powerful listen. 3 days after the statement, the world found out where Ibrahim Traoré would speak. The African Union had arranged an emergency summit in Addis Ababa to discuss economic independence and regional security. Heads of state, diplomats, and media outlets scrambled to attend. Traoré, once seen as a fringe revolutionary, was now center stage. And it wasn't just African leaders watching. Journalists from the BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, and even Fox News set up cameras. Kash Patel, when asked if he planned to apologize, replied smugly, "Apologize? For telling the truth? I'll be watching." The auditorium was silent when Traoré walked in. Dressed simply, without fanfare, he carried no notes, no teleprompter, just a single leather-bound folder. As he took the podium, murmurs faded. He paused, looked across the room. "They called us stupid," he began, his voice steady. "But who wrote our textbooks? Who drained our lands? Who erased our histories and told us our minds were small?" His tone was calm, but his words thundered. "We were not stupid, we were silenced. And now we speak." The room leaned in. This wasn't a rebuttal. It was a reawakening. He opened the folder and displayed classified economic data. Graphs, maps, names of multinationals and government officials linked to African resource extraction. He showed images of children mining cobalt for pennies while billionaires dined in gold-plated halls. If stupidity is choosing justice over profit, then yes, call me stupid, he declared. But do not mistake silence for ignorance, or patience for permission. Gasps followed. Delegates whispered. Reporters scribbled furiously. For every insult hurled at Africa, Traoré was showing receipts. This was not a speech, it was an indictment. Back in Washington, Kash Patel sat in a studio as the speech aired live. He chuckled at first, until the tone shifted. Then his face tensed. His smile faded. By the time Traoré said, "We no longer ask for respect. We command it," the studio had gone quiet. The host tried to pivot, but it was too late. The clip was everywhere. Social feeds exploded with quotes, reactions, and praise. And for the first time in days, Patel said nothing. Because the world wasn't laughing with him anymore. It was listening to Traoré. As dawn broke over Africa, the speech had already become legend. In Accra, street vendors played it on portable radios. In Nairobi, university students projected it on walls, analyzing every phrase. In Johannesburg, elders wept. One woman in Dakar whispered, "My grandfather died in silence. Today we speak." It was no longer just Traoré's words, it was a collective voice finally heard. Newspapers across the continent ran the same front-page headline, "Not stupid. Never again." In Burkina Faso, children carried handmade signs reading, "Traoré taught us dignity." And for once, the Western media couldn't look away. The economic reaction was swift. French mining stocks dropped nearly 4% overnight. American firms with African contracts scrambled to issue statements of solidarity and reflection. Patel's own name began trending, but not favorably. A petition demanding he be barred from future panels garnered over 500,000 signatures in 24 hours. Diplomats tried to soften the fallout, framing it as a teachable moment. But the damage had already been done. For the first time, African dignity wasn't being negotiated behind closed doors. It had been declared, in front of the world. And the world had flinched. Inside the African Union headquarters, leaders met behind closed doors. Several had quietly disagreed with Traoré's radical style, until now. Even longtime skeptics like President Julius Maada Bio of Sierra Leone admitted, he said what we were too afraid to. A coalition formed that evening. The Sovereignty Bloc. 13 nations signed on, pledging to re-evaluate all foreign trade agreements, expel exploitative companies, and create a Pan-African Oversight Board for natural resources. "We will not be mocked again," said a delegate from Ethiopia. "We will own our wealth and our voice." Meanwhile, Traoré remained silent. He refused interviews. No tweets. No follow-ups. When asked by a journalist why, his spokesperson simply said, he didn't speak to go viral. He spoke to change things. And change was happening. In the quiet, something stirred. African unity. Not as an idea but as action. The insult that was meant to belittle had lit a fire in every corner of the continent. And while Kash Patel had vanished from headlines, the name Ibrahim Traoré was now etched into history. Not as a president alone, but as the pulse of a rising people. In Washington, D.C., the atmosphere behind closed doors had shifted from amused detachment to strategic concern. The National Security Council convened an emergency session. A senior analyst, flipping through printouts of Traoré's speech, muttered, "We underestimated him." The CIA had long viewed Burkina Faso as geopolitically minor, but now they were reassessing. One African leader had just destabilized the global perception of Western dominance, not through violence, but with truth. And worse for Washington, the world was cheering. Kash Patel, once a media darling on conservative talk shows, had become an uncomfortable name. His inbox flooded with hate mail, not just from African communities, but from progressives, veterans, and human rights advocates. One retired Marine wrote, "You called him stupid? That was the smartest speech I've heard since Mandela. Fox News producers quietly pulled him from scheduled appearances. His sponsors withdrew. A tweet from his account read, "I stand by my words," but it was drowned out by the thousands of replies attaching clips of Traoré's thunderous address. Inside Burkina Faso, however, Traoré wasn't celebrating. He was already 2 steps ahead. His advisors brought news that several African countries wanted to formalize a pact for gold reserves and resource protection. "We don't need more alliances," he replied. "We need independence, defined by us, on our terms." He called for a summit, not in Paris, not in New York, but in Timbuktu. Symbolic, ancient, African. He wanted every nation who had been dismissed, degraded, or exploited to meet on their soil and define the next chapter. "Let them see," he said, "where real civilization began." At night, Traoré sat alone in his study and wrote a letter by hand. Not to Patel, but to the youth of Africa. "Let them insult us," he wrote. "We will respond with excellence. Let them dismiss us. We will rise in unity. They fear not our armies, but our awakening." That letter, shared by his office the next day, reached over 80 million people in 2 days. From Kigali to Kinshasa, young Africans printed it, read it aloud, carried it like scripture. The response had changed everything. But Traoré knew this was only the beginning. 2 weeks after the speech, Kash Patel resurfaced, not in a studio, not behind a podium, but at a private security conference in Munich. Cameras weren't allowed, but leaks emerged. Witnesses said he was subdued, uncharacteristically quiet. When asked about Ibrahim Traoré, he didn't repeat the slur. He simply said, "He played the long game better than we did." It wasn't an apology, not directly, but for someone like Patel, who built his persona on bravado, it was as close as one would get. And yet, across Africa, no one cared. The world had moved on. He had become irrelevant to the conversation he accidentally sparked. In Burkina Faso, life continued, but differently. Markets played recordings of Traoré's speech between songs. Schools added new curriculum modules on African sovereignty and post-colonial economics. Churches and mosques hosted forums. Artists created murals of the president's face with the quote, "We command respect." One young girl in Niger wrote an essay titled, "Why Being African is Not a Weakness," and won a national prize. The insult had mutated into pride. What had once been a moment of disrespect had become a generational pivot. Meanwhile, Traoré prepared for the Timbuktu summit. It would be historic, not only for its symbolism, but for what would be proposed. The draft agenda included the creation of a joint African digital currency backed by gold, the expulsion of exploitative mining firms, and a continental tribunal for colonial-era reparations. Delegates from 31 nations confirmed attendance. Even diaspora leaders from the Caribbean and South America requested observer status. What began as a response to a petty insult was becoming a continental reset. One built not on revenge, but on restoration. Traoré, however, stayed grounded. In his weekly national address, he said, "Do not praise me for standing up. Praise yourselves for standing with me. One man cannot carry a continent, but together, we carry history forward." The crowd erupted in applause. His humility was no performance. It was the very reason people believed in him. Because while others spoke of power, he spoke of purpose. And that purpose now had a name, a vision, and a momentum that no insult could erase. The age of silence was over. The age of African voice had begun. The eyes of the world turned to Timbuktu. Under the sweltering sun and ancient architecture, African leaders gathered, not in suits and ties, but in garments reflecting their nation's cultures. Traoré stood at the entrance of the Grand Hall of Manuscripts, welcoming each delegate personally. No red carpets. No military parade. Just respect. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. This wasn't about returning to the past, but reclaiming its stolen threads. The continent wasn't asking for inclusion anymore. It was writing its own invitation, on its own land, in its own voice. As the summit opened, Traoré addressed the assembly. For centuries, Africa has been the guest at someone else's table. Today we build our own. His words didn't echo from loudspeakers. They settled like seeds in the minds of every representative present. Delegates from Senegal, Tanzania, Angola, even nations once at odds, stood shoulder to shoulder. The proposals were bold: a new Pan-African bank insulated from Western interference, cross-border water-sharing accords, and a moratorium on raw material exports until fair trade mechanisms were established. It was radical. It was ambitious. It was real. The West watched with anxiety. Analysts on global news outlets debated the viability of Traoré's dream. European ministers called emergency meetings. If they pull this off, a leaked memo from Brussels read, "We lose decades of strategic leverage." Financial markets wobbled. Gold prices surged. Oil executives began lobbying for diplomatic intervention. But interference was no longer an easy option. African nations had seen what was possible when they stood united, not under fear, but under vision. The summit was not a protest. It was a proposal, and one that dared the world to treat Africa as a partner, not a pawn. On the final day of the summit, as dusk fell and winds blew sand across the ancient stones, Traoré lit a ceremonial torch before the delegates. "This flame," he said, "is not just fire. It is every ancestor who dreamed of this moment, and every child who will inherit what we do next." The crowd rose. No applause, just silence and reverence. In that silence, a new kind of power was born, one that could not be assassinated, discredited, or silenced, because it didn't belong to one man. It belonged to Africa. The global reaction to the Timbuktu summit was swift, but hidden behind smiles. While public statements from the West spoke of respect for African autonomy and welcoming reform, private channels painted a different picture. Intelligence agencies began running silent assessments. Diplomatic cables from Washington, Paris, and London were filled with quiet panic. One French memo leaked to the press said, "Traoré is not a populist. He is a strategist, and he's 10 moves ahead." That terrified them more than any uprising ever could. In response, Western powers began activating soft influence networks. Offers of aid packages were quietly dangled before hesitant African states. Promises of debt relief, military equipment, and infrastructure deals began arriving in inboxes of finance ministers from Accra to Kigali. But Traoré had warned them this would happen. "Their strategy is not to attack," he told his fellow leaders. "It's to divide. Don't accept handshakes wrapped in chains." Several leaders paused. Some wavered, but none walked away. The trust Traoré had built now anchored the entire alliance. Within Burkina Faso, Traoré's domestic approval soared. He wasn't just a leader, he had become a symbol. Women in rural villages began naming their newborn sons Ibrahim. Youth groups organized forums titled "From Gold to Sovereignty." Farmers donated a portion of their harvest to the National Gold Reserve Fund, seeing it not as tax, but as legacy. The president's cabinet, once filled with technocrats, now included historians, economists, and Pan-African thinkers. The goal was clear: don't just reclaim resources, reclaim narrative, memory, and meaning. And yet, Traoré knew the next attack wouldn't come in the form of speeches or sanctions. It would be covert, information warfare, false flags, internal sabotage. He increased cybersecurity protocols and created a special independent media team to monitor disinformation. "We're not paranoid," he said. "We're prepared." The world had underestimated him once. It wouldn't happen again. Because this movement was no longer his alone, it belonged to a continent, rising not in anger, but in clarity. The shadow games had begun. But so had Africa's awakening. It started with a headline on a European news site, Burkina Faso's gold missing. Is Traoré hiding billions? Within hours, dozens of similar articles flooded the internet. Anonymous sources, doctored documents, fake whistleblower accounts. Social media bots pushed the narrative, he's just another African dictator. Hashtags like hashtag #TraorFraud and hashtag #WhereIsTheGold trended worldwide. Western media acted surprised, but in Ouagadougou, no one was. Traoré had predicted it. They will come for our credibility first, he told his team. Then for our unity. And finally for our peace. But this time, Africa was ready. Within 24 hours, a continent-wide digital counteroffensive was launched. African programmers and journalists formed The Shield, an online fact-checking coalition spanning 15 countries. Every lie was met with truth, every smear with receipts. Leaked IMF memos, contracts from European mining firms, and historical evidence of looted reserves began circulating online. Hashtags like hashtag Africanos and hashtag HandSoftware took over. Young Africans, previously divided by borders and languages, were now unified by something deeper: purpose. And then came the moment that broke the Western narrative entirely. A global audit firm, independent and internationally respected, released a statement: no gold is missing. The reserves are intact. President Traoré's fiscal transparency exceeds most OECD nations. The silence from the accusers was deafening. Kash Patel, trying to revive his influence, made a post claiming the audit was bought. But nobody listened. His name had become synonymous with failure. Traoré didn't even address him anymore. He's not my opponent, he told reporters. He's a reflection of the system I'm dismantling. Meanwhile, preparations continued for the implementation of the African digital currency. Backed by real gold, it would free member nations from the volatility of foreign-controlled reserves. Economists called it the most radical financial shift since Bretton Woods. But to Traoré, it was simply justice. Our people were made to think freedom was a myth, he said. Now, we're turning it into math. And the numbers were beginning to terrify the old world. Because when a people who've been robbed for centuries start doing their own accounting, the empire trembles. Traoré arrived at the United Nations flanked not by bodyguards or advisors, but by 12 young Africans, scientists, poets, engineers, and descendants of resistance fighters. The symbolism was deliberate. I don't come here alone, he declared. I come with the voices you silenced. The General Assembly fell quiet. Some diplomats shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward. Cameras rolled. For once, the world wasn't tuning in for war, sanctions, or crisis. They were here to watch an African president rewrite the script of global diplomacy, on his own terms. He held up a single gold coin. It bore no queen, no president, no empire, just the outline of Africa and one word: returned. This, he said, is not currency. It is confession. He then laid out, in meticulous detail, how over 80% of African gold reserves from the colonial era were still being exploited through neo-colonial financial agreements. He listed companies. He named banks. He cited clauses buried in trade treaties signed under pressure decades ago. The room tensed. The French delegation whispered among themselves. A German envoy left the chamber. But Traoré kept going. His final request shocked everyone. I propose a vote, he said, that the United Nations recognize the concept of economic reparations through resource sovereignty, not as charity, not as guilt, but as acknowledgement of theft and the right to reclaim. Murmurs rippled across the room. Some called it outrageous. Others called it overdue. But no one called it untrue. For the first time, the word reparations wasn't coming from activists outside the building. It was echoing from its center stage. And it wasn't a plea. It was a demand. Outside, crowds gathered with flags, drums, and tears. In Nairobi, Students camped out overnight to watch the speech live. In Rio de Janeiro, Afro-Brazilian communities marched in solidarity. In Haiti, church bells rang. Whether or not the resolution passed was secondary. What mattered was that the world had heard, clearly, finally. Africa had spoken not with guns, nor with rage, but with fact, dignity, and unshakable conviction. And there was no going back. The empire had been named. The receipts had been presented. Now came the reckoning. If you made it this far, comment where you're watching from and let us know if the story of justice moved you.